Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. The COVID-19 pandemic is more than a health crisis. It has exacerbated inequalities and has become an opportunity to fuel hate speech and misogyny, promote draconian policies, deploy violence against vulnerable groups, and unleash the discourse and practice of war. Amid all these, we see the failure in governance and the ineptitude of leaders to respond to health and socio-economic needs. Seemingly, the strategy was to further concentrate power and resources through legislation and policy, harvest loyalty through preferential treatment of allies, silence dissent, and perpetuate a culture of impunity. The Asia-Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect-Philippine Office, based at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Political Science, and the Mourning and the After of the Ateneo Areté Sandbox Residency, and in cooperation with the Commission on Human Rights, bring together thought provocateurs who would walk us through the relevance of transitional justice in the time of COVID-19. We welcome you all this morning, those in Zoom and those in the live stream platform in the CHR's FB page. So we will now formally begin. I turn it over to my co-moderator, Mr. Bobby Garcia, to actually introduce our thought provocateurs. Go ahead, Bobby.
Thank you very much, Bennett. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for being here in this very important webinar. We are lucky to have 4 distinguished speakers for this morning. The first is Loretta Ann Rosales, whom we fondly call ETA, the former chair of the Commission on Human Rights and also a former representative at the lower house of Congress. Marian Pastor Roses, an independent curator and critic and book author as well. Ruben Carranza, senior associate of International Center for Transitional Justice. And Cecilia Jimenez Damari, whom we fondly call Sedge, the presently UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons. So the first part of our program is to give a question that would be common to all 4 speakers, and then each of them will be responding for a maximum of 5 minutes, and then this will be followed up by a question specific to each speaker. So the first common question to all is, what view does transitional justice lens bring into focus during a pandemic? Okay, so does any of the speakers want to begin? Who would like to begin first? Otherwise, I will just call.
A recitation.
Recitation.
Bobby, thank you. Sige, I'll get the ball rolling, if that's okay. Yes.
Yeah,
hello.
Sure. Go ahead, Seth.
Sige, thank you very much, Bobby, and thank you, Vinay, and to all the organizers for this very important initiative. I'm very pleased to be with the co-panelists. Since I'm taking the floor, perhaps it would be just important for us to be reminded of what is transitional justice. Well, first of all, it's about ways that countries have to deal with large-scale or systematic human rights violations. But there is no one way to practice transitional justice, given the variety of contexts, and this of the pandemic is already one of them. But transitional justice, in our view, is always rooted in accountability and the redress for victims. So what is important with transitional justice is really the application of a human rights policy in particular circumstances like the COVID-19 pandemic. It's always an attempt to provide the most meaningful justice possible in the political conditions at that time, whether or not this is with regard to the past or an emerging pattern of systematic human rights violations. So in this way, just to recall, we have 4 pillars of transitional justice, and I'm already putting it on the table now because it is very important for us to go back and forth to: the right to truth, the right to justice, the right to reparation, and of course the right of guarantees non-recurrence. In the context of the pandemic, in my view, the application of the 4 pillars of transitional justice are important in many different ways. First of all, in the assessment, what is happening in terms of the violations? What is happening in terms of accountability? Second, the 4 pillars are also important to look into the aspects of that relate to what is currently doable at the moment. And in my view, it is all pillars: right to truth, justice, reparations, and of course guarantees. But the third is also important. And the third is in preparation for a more long-haul endeavor for justice. And as a human rights advocate, one of the things that is really significant in anything that has to be done now and in the future is to ensure that there is always the right to truth. And this, as far as human rights defenders are concerned, of course, would be documentation. Lastly, already a big lesson is the fact that prevention is always the best solution. It may be too late, but this is should always be part and parcel of the mindset that we have as transitional justice advocates. Because under the present circumstances, we may be looking back as what could have been done, but with that in mind, we also have to look forward as what can be done now with the transitional justice lens and in the future, so that we can do what they call do better. There is evidence, for example, in internal displacement situations worldwide, that those countries who were more prepared to handle internal displacement and have been more responsive to the human rights of internally displaced persons in the first place, these countries have definitely been more prepared to handle the pandemic insofar as they relate to internally displaced persons. For example, does a country have the IDP protection law and have good governance systems? You know, this really kicked into the full in many of those countries that do have IDP protection laws insofar as the handling of the pandemic is concerned. Another example, if the country has already a very good set data and analysis structure, then it is much more easy for the health authorities to access the IDPs. Another example, if the IDPs have been assisted in their human rights before in a systematic manner, including the right to health, it has been easier to control the pandemic and answer the health needs also relating to the social needs of the internally displaced persons. The bottom line on all of this, which I will discuss a little bit more later, is of course the participation of IDPs in the process. So I will stop there for the moment, and I look forward to hearing from the other thought provocateurs.
Thank you very much, Sedge, for giving us an overview, a definition and framework of transitional justice and how it can be seen in light of the current pandemic, as well as describing what its effects are on the current displacement situation. Who would like to follow Sedge?
Bobby?
Marianne.
Yeah, I might as well do so because my view is a kind of broad and long view. And so let me begin by saying that the lens of transitional justice obliges us to look at institutions, because institutions are what will ultimately create the environment, the social environment and the cultural environment for justice to take place in a systematic way. So the long view that I'd like to offer this morning, as this pandemic plays out, is to say that, well, firstly, we don't know how long it's going to last. And during this entire period, we have been given the entire spectacle of institutions that have either, whatever you wish to call it, eroded or collapsed. During the last 4 months, Filipinos have seen the 3 branches of government, the church, the media, the educational system, all reeling from systems failure. And we see it every day. We see it in the fact that the pandemic is actually not being solved. That there are poorer and poorer people. Hunger is going to stop the land. The IDPs are in trouble. I mean, the entire range of social problems are not being addressed. And let's look at it as systemic and institutional problems first and foremost. So the executive branch, Congress, the Supreme Court do not work in the interests of a democratic nation. The beleaguered members of the media themselves will acknowledge that even prior to the present dispensation, an extraordinary percentage of their ranks are corrupt. The media themselves say so. And it seems very much the case that the failure of the Roman Catholic Church to cohere around a single message against clear signs of authoritarianism and murder draws, at least in part, from the corruption of a number of bishops during another administration. So it's equally clear that the educational system has not produced enough Filipinos with faculties for critical thinking or a trained courage, who are therefore vulnerable to cyber operations that dismantle systems of truth and are therefore confused. As for the National Police Force, whether the Tokhang number is 5,000 or 3,000 does not matter in the argument. It is immaterial to the clear culpability of the Philippine National Police in the exercise of a murderous rampage against the poor, primarily. The police action against illegal drugs, designed and pushed by the highest officials of the Philippines, has undermined the very basis of a democratic order, the Constitution of the Philippines. Now, until about 2 weeks ago, I thought the military was the one institution that escaped democratic decay. I had previously thought that the military as an institution had remained fairly intact and that the democratic reform of the armed forces over the past decades has taken root and reshaped this institution from its murderous 1970s character to an upright core of soldiers supporting democracy. However, the sponsorship and support of the AFP top brass of the anti-terror law has indicated that the military too may have been vulnerable to the corruptive force of creeping authoritarianism. All this have, of course, been happening for decades. It's not just during the pandemic, it's not just during the present dispensation, it's been going on. Our situation in the Philippines cannot be described, therefore, as systems with corrupt people who undermine the functions of the institutions they serve. What we are seeing are not corrupt people and bad actors alone. We are seeing corrupted institutions. The accurate description is that the institutions themselves are corrupted systems. Democratic decay occurs inside the infrastructure of these systems. And when a leader arrives on the scene, as it has, with an anti-democratic agenda and with the potential for atrocity, the already weak institutions have been relatively easy to further destroy. They became ready-made for destruction and appropriation. So transitional justice makes it abundantly clear that no justice for ongoing and previous crimes against humanity can be achieved without the long-term work of institution building. The view is the view of the long haul. The view is the complexity of the interrelationships amongst eroded institutions and how one institution helps erode another institution and create a horrifying ecosystem. The view that we see now is that transitional justice is a daunting task. But there are good things to say. And I don't like to kind of leave with that idea of a horrifying ecosystem. It is clear that the 1987 Constitution remains in place and has been protected from bad actors thus far. It is also clear that whatever infirmities this Constitution now shows because of the changes in the world, it provided the Philippines with a Commission on Human Rights that has been true to its mandate since 1987. That is nothing it's something we have to be proud of. The CHR may be the single or among the few institutions that have survived the corrupting effects of anti-democratic energies. Moreover, and this is to me very important, the Philippine Democratic Project that began in the late 19th century has produced a culture that prizes consultation, community-driven development, the importance of local governance, and the endurance of struggles for equality and justice. This culture exists. Transitional justice for present day and possible atrocities will have to work with the potential for restoring institutions within what I call a Philippine culture. During a pandemic as extreme as that we are experiencing, all this is clear to me. And so it's daunting, but we have something to work with. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marian, for sharing your views on the state of our institutions, how they are being eroded and actually being corrupted. But the silver linings are there as well. Now, I'm sure Etta cannot wait a few more seconds to give her views, so I'll give the floor to you, Etta.
Yeah, Bobby. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for this initiative of the two institutions that have given us this webinar. I think it's so exciting. And I'm so happy that Sedge gave the framework and that Marian gave the long haul and the institutions and the kind of culture that we are experiencing right now and the challenges. Because I am going to look at this from a very personal point of view that provides, you know, the history of how transitional justice came to us in the Philippines from my own personal point of view. So let me start now. It was in several conferences, I think either in Bangkok, Sydney, or Manila. I can't remember the specific dates, where there were discussions of the atrocities of genocide and armed conflict that first brought my attention and interest to several of these new concerns. Initially, the concepts that came about, the responsibility to protect, that underscored the need for preventive measures to preempt the worsening of conditions that could lead to human rights atrocities and even genocide, especially in struggling countries like ours, where state systems are weak and diverse forces compete for economic and social resources under conditions of extreme poverty and hunger. Well, the Philippines then, at that time, I think this was the first decade of the 21st century, caught international attention for the victory of the Filipino people in ousting the dictator Marcos after 21 years, 14 of which were under dictatorial rule. This took place in 1986. On hindsight, I must have been invited to this series of conferences to share experiences as a mass leader, arrested, tortured, and imprisoned twice, but coming out a survivor and participating in the uprising that ousted the dictator. I realized too the interest these conferences had in the post-Marcos struggle. Many of us human rights activists engaged in that resulted in a class suit victory we won in the Federal Court of Hawaii through the painstaking perseverance of our lead counsel, attorney Robert Swift, and his group of lawyers, including Rod Domingo, Robert Fruto, and so on. I would also have to mention the importance of a fair, just, and humane federal judge in Hawaii, Judge Manuel Riel, who throughout his term never hesitated to look at the side of justice and human rights in the series of rulings he made that finally resulted in the class suit victory we won, awarding us $1.9 billion as compensation for the 9,539 class victims of martial law. This was later on followed in time by a historical piece of legislation when I finally won a seat as party list representative of the Bayan Citizens Action Party in the Philippine Congress, where we legislated a bill that provided national recognition for the martyrdom of Filipinos who fought and died for their country, and reparation for their kin and all survivors of martial law atrocities under the Marcos regime. We passed a law which significantly for the first time, made Marcos, and later on, of course, all other despots following him, accountable and liable for the atrocities and crimes committed during his regime, and also would commit against their people in subsequent regimes. So this was a very significant piece of legislation. I guess it was in the sharing of this post-Marcos experiences that I came across the concept of transitional justice that sought to look into the historical past atrocities of a country that has suffered much in armed and social conflict, a past that must have been paved the way for the state and people to painstakingly work inclusively to provide the victims of mass atrocities the justice they deserve, a justice that will empower them to know their rights and empowered seek access for the injustices committed against them, and inclusively, with the instruments of the state, work for reparation and guarantee that such pain and violence should never occur again. Having said all of this, the phenomenon of a pandemic in the ordinary lens of one's understanding is humbling, confusing, hurting, disempowering, inviting insecurities and fear. But using the lens of transitional justice, the TJ approach helps us gradually go back to our historical past, but this time, not solely from the historical human past, but from the historical pandemic past. And the pandemic introduces us right away to our historical relationship with nature and all her strength and power and disinterest in the plight of humans who across the ages have related to her with utter ignorance, irresponsibility, avarice, and even greed, where technology and its advances have helped humans to develop nature for the advancement of human civilization, yes, but because of it, human avarice and greed, technology and the social and political systems have likewise destroyed nature's natural resources with such negligence and abandon, thereby helping to bring about climate change that pushes the animals and insects and microbes to change their behavior and modes of survival, resulting in the pandemics that have been brought forth in large extent by these behavioral changes. So I'll end up with that because I think that it's a very big challenge that we face right now because, as pointed out by Marian, we feel the trend of right-wing, dictatorships all around us, anti-terror laws all around us. It is not just the Philippines that has passed an anti-terror law surrounding us in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and even in the Western countries. The anti-terror law is there to stay, to divide the differences between authoritarianism and democracy. I'll end right there.
Thank you very much, Etta. That was very useful in describing the history of the Philippines in doing our own brand of transitional justice through our victory in the U.S. class suit and the law that compensates human rights violations victims during the time of Marcos. Now we can proceed with our the only rose among the thorns, or the only thorn among the roses among our speakers, Ruben Carranza, straight from New York.
Salamat, Bobby. And magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Gabi dito, but I'll try to stay awake. And I think all the comments so far are very provocative and I think very helpful in understanding both transitional justice as a concept and how it has been applied, has failed, has succeeded in different ways in the Philippines. I'll try to cover some operational aspects of that, but also to talk a little bit about international experiences and how what they teach us about pursuing transitional justice in the Philippines during a pandemic, and perhaps even after the pandemic, or if not after the pandemic, after Duterte, in a post-Duterte context. A couple of things I'd like to say. Well, Sedge has talked about transitional justice, and I work in an international NGO called the International Center for Transitional Justice. While we work in New York, our work, most of it so far, has happened outside the United States. And most of it has happened in both post-conflict countries and in post-dictatorship countries. And so it's from this perspective that I'd say a couple of things that will help us navigate these questions of what to do during a pandemic in relation to transitional justice, and what we can do right now to prepare for a post-Duterte agenda for accountability. So prior to the pandemic, transitional justice was facing two opportunities and challenges. One opportunity presented itself during the Arab Spring. And as many of you know, the Arab Spring led to the downfall of dictatorships in several Middle Eastern and North African countries, from Tunisia to Syria. And while those dictatorships fell, not all of them fell and led to a relatively more democratic, more accountable governance. In many of these countries, the dictatorship was succeeded by conflict instead. But after the Arab Spring, transitional justice was presented with an opportunity to make itself even more relevant. Because in the Arab Spring countries, there was not just demands for accountability involving corruption, involving human rights abuses, but also demands for accountability that involve social and economic grievances. A good example of this is Tunisia, where I have done a lot of work. Because in Tunisia, the grievances were not just about torture committed by the Ben Ali dictatorship or killings committed by policemen under the dictatorship, but also corruption, and that not just corruption and human rights abuses, but also the lack of jobs, the lack of access to social and economic rights. So this intersection between conflict, abuses, corruption, and social and economic grievances gave transitional justice an opportunity to make itself relevant. And in Tunisia, one of the manifestations of that relevance was in the fact that a truth commission was established, but it wasn't just a truth and justice commission, but a commission that called itself the Truth and Dignity Commission. Now, the emphasis on dignity is important because much of the Arab Spring revolved around the concept of dignity in Arab societies. And in Arab societies, having a job, having a livelihood was central to the idea of dignity. So this was an opportunity, and to some extent, transitional justice made use of it. But transitional justice prior to the pandemic also faced a challenge. And this challenge was captured by the election of someone like Rodrigo Duterte, which is the emergence of populist, authoritarian, but elected leaders. How should we hold those leaders accountable? How should we argue that transitional justice, or even just justice more generally, should apply to those who commit abuses, who carry out violations of human rights, but with a significant degree of popular support? What should transitional justice do to make itself not just relevant, but appropriate in those situations? And that's still a difficult question for transitional justice to answer. And in many ways, that question is still pending. And we can go back to that later. So with the opportunity and the challenge, it was already difficult for transitional justice to try to make itself even more meaningful and to respond to these. But then the pandemic happened. So you can imagine the difficulty of trying to pursue transitional justice in which social and economic grievances, such as those raised in the Arab Spring, have to be dealt with. And then a pandemic that tests access to healthcare, that tests access to livelihood happens. So how do you design your transitional justice processes in the midst of that? So in my work right now, I'm facing those kinds of challenges and dilemmas. And some of the answers are not easy. I was just, for example, doing some remote work for South Sudan, where a peace agreement includes a transitional justice chapter. And one of the most basic challenges in pursuing transitional justice in South Sudan is the question of participation of citizens. It's a literal challenge. How do citizens participate in consultations, for example, to create a hybrid court in South Sudan or to establish a truth commission in South Sudan when they can't even go out? And how do citizens who are still, and Sedge would be aware of this, who are still in camps for internally displaced participate when they are just simply trying to survive given the impossibility of social distancing in those camps? So these are now challenges on top of the existing challenges that transitional justice faces. Now for the Philippines, and as a second point, the experience with transitional justice also teaches us several lessons. And some of these lessons are in fact being learned in a few other countries. There are many, but let me focus on two. One lesson from the Philippines is that pursuing both corruption and human rights violations is necessary in post-dictatorship countries. Pursuing both corruption and human rights violations. You cannot just pursue corruption. You cannot just pursue human rights violations. You have to try to pursue both in post-authoritarian countries. Now, this is not a unique lesson from the Philippines. In the same period that ETA talked about earlier, countries such as South Korea or even Chad pursued both corruption and human rights violations in their truth commissions, in their prosecutions against former dictators and those who committed abuses under them. Now, those lessons from the Philippines, South Korea, and Chad were later learned in countries of a wide range, from Peru to Kenya, or even in South Africa. Now, South Africa, I should mention, is often cited as an example of a country that has the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what's important to note is that South Africa, several years after its original Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created a new commission called a State Capture Commission to investigate corruption, or at least some aspects of corruption committed during apartheid. So it's learning a lesson that came from the Philippines decades ago and trying to apply it now. Now, a second lesson from the Philippine experience is that truth-telling is indispensable. There was never a truth commission in the Philippines. There was the Philippine Commission on Human Rights, which is different from the Commission on Human Rights now in the Philippine Constitution, but it disbanded soon after the Mindiola Massacre in 1987. So in the absence of a truth commission, the impact is frustrating because the impact is not just for victims so that they can tell the truth of what happened to them. The impact of truth telling is important for bystanders, those who never experienced human rights violations. The impact of truth telling is important for voters, those who would elect persons who might themselves have to be held accountable. If there is no truth telling, it will be very challenging to talk about lessons from the past and to say, this is what we should try to prevent from happening again. And then the third lesson from the Philippines is that transitional justice must address historic injustices. This is what the Bangsamoro transitional justice process has tried to do. And I had the privilege of working with Sedge on the Bangsamoro transitional justice process. But even that process has its limits. And one of those limits is a factor in what the Philippines is confronting now. The Bangsamoro transitional justice was I think a substantive and good example of how to design a transitional justice process involving historic injustices. The problem is that outside of that process, an agenda was superimposed, some by donors and some by the Philippine government itself, and that is the counter-terrorism agenda. When you superimpose a counter-terrorism agenda on a transitional justice process that involves historic injustices, you distort the process, you assign goals to it that should never be assigned to transitional justice. And so now it exacerbates rather than helps the effort to address historic injustices in the Philippines. So as a final point, the election of Rodrigo Duterte demonstrates that transitional justice is not a panacea for impunity. It's not a total solution for corruption. It's not a step that will completely prevent human rights violations. What transitional justice would have done and can still do for the Philippines is to remind people that accountability must be constantly pursued, that accountability should not happen only when there is a revolution, when there is an uprising, but that it must be a constant process. Now, that problem of not having accountability mechanisms in place has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The pandemic did not cause impunity in the Philippines. The pandemic did not create corruption or human rights violations in the Philippines. It exacerbates it, but now transitional justice has to address both the exacerbated inequalities in the pandemic and the impunity that was already there before the pandemic. So let me stop there, Bobby.
Thank you very much. That's very complicated. Dami nating problema. Thanks, Ruben, for giving the lessons on transitional justice, and it's a very important observation. Normally, tyrants commit human rights violations and also steal. Nagva-violate na, corrupt pa, and those are the twin evils of tyranny that we need to always face. Now, for the next part of our program, we have prepared a number of questions specific to the speakers, but actually many of these questions have been one way or another answered by the narrative in the first set. So maybe I think Eta is trying to raise her hand. No? Okay. So we can probably push through with the guide questions, and then the speaker can just try to elaborate on the question or choose some parts of their presentation to emphasize. So let's begin with the first speaker, Sedge. The prepared question is, what are the narratives and memories of violation, pain, and loss that we can unravel to foreground the right to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-recurrence? As we have heard from your presentation earlier, you have touched on this question and even focused on the phenomenon of internal displacement. Would you want to elaborate on some parts of this? Yes.
Sige. Maraming salamat, Bobby, and thanks again to Eta, Marian, and Ruben. I think our answers to the question as thought provocateurs was also very helpful in enabling us to see the different aspects of the application of the transitional justice lens to the current situation. Already the lens of human rights and transitional justice, it's there, provide us how a clear focus on the person or the people whose rights have been violated and the corresponding obligations of those who are expected under law to provide redress so that justice can be drawn. So klarong-klaro to, may biktima, may therefore may biktima ng violation, and then meron ding accountability ang duty bearers. This is a human rights classic framework. But the great thing about transitional justice, of course it's also limited, is that it provides us certain approaches. But it is important, in my view, that the identification of the people whose rights have been violated is really an important part of the process. Hindi to dapat top-down. Oy, kami yung may alam sa transitional justice, ito ang dapat gawin. We have to listen. We have to have the victims participate. It is important, their own participation is essential in the very process itself. That's why the right to truth is a very good starting point and a very good endpoint of all these processes, because it is not only the facts themselves that are important to the right to truth. Alam nyo, kaming mga abogado gusto namin facts, no? But likewise, the narratives. Because it is the pain, it's the suffering of the people. Ano ba yung pinagdaanan nila na kailangan talagang hangkutin? At ito rin na magiging basihan kung paano sila magiging participative. And for them, the process is their process. It's not our process. But because it is the narratives that enables us, the identification of the people whose rights have been violated is really, because it is the narratives that enables the advocates to ensure that the process is relevant to the victims of human rights violation and gross neglect. So what I am trying to really emphasize here is that it's not only the end result that we are aiming for, it's the process. And that process needs to have the participation of the people themselves. And not only the victims, but also the participation of society. And Ruben touched on that very clearly, that the society has to be involved. It's truth-telling processes should actually be based on a whole of society approach. It was my experience on transitional justice in various parts of Asia, including the Philippines, of course, during my stint as a commissioner of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission for the Bangsamoro, that I brought into my mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. And that's where I basically provided, I delivered, and I gave my report to the UN General Assembly on transitional justice and internal displacement, a first of its kind. And I remember that Ruben and I were in New York talking about this and how important it is to really raise the visibility of how transitional justice applies to internally displaced persons. Lalo na ngayon. The recognition of IDPs having the right to participate fully in all these mechanisms and processes, these have to be reinforced. That's one of my recommendations in my report to the General Assembly. And this must also be the responsibility of governments to guarantee such participation in practice. As has been pointed out, how do you do this in the context of the pandemic? Already, I have issued already, I think, 2 or 3 press releases and press statements in the last 3-4 months as a UN Special Rapporteur, calling on governments not to forget internally displaced persons, ensure their participation, ensure they are consulted, ensure that particularly those IDPs who are in camps or even those who are not in camps, because many are nakikitira lang, are actually part and parcel of the holistic health response to the pandemic. So to effectively respond to internal displacement, they should be seen to form part of the broader society. Hindi sila dapat marginalized because they've always been looked at, IDPs, yeah, should have a separate program. No, because it is important they are also part and parcel of the solutions and not the problems. So any response to the pandemic can only be coherent if all the marginalized people, like the internally displaced persons, are included in that health response. Programs should therefore be designed and implemented in a holistic manner so that the different measures to address displacement-related injustices, for example, as far as internally displaced persons are concerned, are mutually reinforcing. So IDPs, internally displaced persons, is of course only one group. We have other groups, and they have been mentioned already by my fellow panelists. But one of the things is that internal displacement is seen only to be a humanitarian and sometimes development situation. I'm sorry, but I really beg to disagree. Internally displaced persons are our own citizens. We know that in the Philippines. We know that also in the countries that I go to. They are part and parcel of the citizenry. And so like any other people, all of these marginalized vulnerable groups of people have to participate in these transitional justice mechanisms in or processes, you know, and although for the moment we don't really have formal mechanisms, but the elements are there, even in the pandemic or despite the pandemic. So we have to build on that. And this is really where I see transitional justice lens can play a very significant role in facilitating the solutions of all these vulnerable groups, and a critical aspect of achieving justice, of course, reparations, and guarantees for non-recurrence based on their own participation, and of course, in the pursuit of the right to truth. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, Sedge. I mean, it is actually very, very difficult that, you know, in the time of pandemic, we're trying to very, very hard to actually ensure that participation is there, and even more so when you're talking about vulnerable and marginalized groups. So that, in a sense, this has to be continuously unpacked, and has to be not just unpacked, but, you know, continuously recognized and done concretely. And it's, speaking of unpacking, my next question is actually to Marian. Essentially, you know, we've been talking about the context of exacerbation of, in terms of violence, in terms of human rights violations, and so on and so forth. So my question to you, Marian, is, through transitional justice, as political and socio-economic drivers of violence are unpacked in the context of increasing authoritarianism, and it's not just increasing, it's even, you know, being legalized to a certain degree. So what do you think are the ways forward that can be discerned? Marian?
All right, hello. Thank you again for having me here. The first thing that comes to mind is, we do not wait for better times.
Yes.
We do not wait for the pandemic to end. The first thing the pandemic teaches us is that there will be no new normal. There's no horizon like that. We have to work on this now. So the IDPs that Sedge talks about, we have to work to surface what's going on with them right now. It's not as though they stopped being IDPs during the pandemic, as Sedge points out. It needs attention right now. Marawi, the entire problem of what happened to Marawi after that siege is an ongoing sore. The pandemic has not changed that, it exacerbated it. And so the lesson of the pandemic is that it has to go on. The work of transitional justice has to go on. So we work right now at renewing what institutions are absolutely necessary to rebuild, restore, strengthen, in order to transition, hopefully in the near future, to make justice possible. This has been clear to me, made clear to me by experiences during the last 4 months, during the lockdown, when in the most constraining circumstances, Filipinos have actually jumped up to feed the hungry, to plan alternative economic transitions, to try to protest and prevent unjust killings. We have Filipinos who have continued to do so. And so the pandemic has not stopped Filipinos from doing so. The level of activity has intensified instead of diminished. The ways forward have to be understood through the learnings of the pandemic as urgent. And I cannot overemphasize that. All of this is urgent. We don't have the luxury of time. The long haul, this is a long haul. And we do need macro perspectives, and we do need to take them seriously, but the work now, the work has to be done now to make sure that the long haul is even possible, to make justice possible in the long run, even if it may not be possible today or in the immediate future, but certainly things can be done so that there might be some promise of some justice in the future, for example, for the victims of Tokhang. So I have a list of 5 propositions, which I think are both practical and in a way philosophically driven. As I enumerate, I should like the participants to understand that the pandemic has actually made these ideas clearer to me. First, work should increase and quicken towards creating a constituency for human rights and transitional justice way beyond our old fellowships that are driven by victim families and the religious and legal communities. It has to be bigger than the old constituency. We are forever grateful for their persistence and endurance, and now thank them from the bottom of our hearts. Human beings like Eta Rosales, thank you. And by way of thank you, we have to actively expand the constituency to include other sectors, arts and media, economists, finance people, educators, of course, and so on and so forth. This is absolutely necessary at this point in time because it cannot be a sectoral concern. There has to be a constituency for transitional justice that is beyond the old constituencies. In fact, transitional justice has to be demanded by the public in general. It must be not only cross-sectoral, as I said, but it must be a public concern just like water and food. Second, the stories have to continue to be collected. Of course, we know that. This is ongoing. It can be increased, etc., but we are all aware of this. This is the sine qua non of our advocacy. However, the pandemic has taught us that digital interconnectivity has been left to bad actors. And so it is time to take it back. And we've seen during the pandemic that Filipinos who are good actors have actually begun to take back digital interconnectivity. So data collection, sharing of narratives, the explorations of other ways forward for transitional justice is now going to pivot, I believe, on both informal and formal uses of digital media. Take it back. We need digital media to advance transitional justice. Historical injustice has to be taken seriously by everyone who uses cyberspace. Okay. Third, we do need to choose one or two institutions, I mean, for pragmatic reasons, to build a constituency around the rebuilding of. I'm sorry, that's kind of convoluted. Do we choose the media? Do we choose the judiciary? Saan pwedeng makipagkapit-bisig? Who can we ally with? So that that institution whom we might think might be the pivotal one, because we have limited resources and we need to focus, that perhaps, let's say, hypothetically, we focus on rebuilding the judiciary. There are clear steps to be taken right now, and there are long haul steps, but it becomes practical. It becomes like I'm not suggesting the judiciary necessarily. I mean, you could choose to rebuild the military or the police, but certainly rebuild an institution outside the legal system alone. All right. This is very much a part of what is close to my heart and my practice as a curator, because of my fourth recommendation. Contested narratives is my work, and museums and curatorship will have to take up historical injustice and transitional justice for the future, for the present, as a very serious and fundamental part of the practice in countries like the Philippines, which has a depth of horror, in the fund of horror stories that are not communicated to the next generations. And so curators should very seriously think about what stories have been emphasized, what stories have been eclipsed, what stories have not been given attention, why, what have museums been doing? And I'm not just talking here about exhibits on human rights violations. I'm talking about all exhibits, in the same manner that monuments are now being torn down all over the United States. The idea, for example, of the Cultural Center being an Imelda Marcos edifice should be rethought and exercised. The Cultural Center of the Philippines should not be a monument to Imelda Marcos. The symbols of our country will have to be re-examined for what they stood for and how these symbols prevented or eclipsed human rights violations and dreadful things in the past. The educational system is a natural place to think about, but I think just looking at symbols all around us and what these symbols symbolize, as a matter of fact, street names, etc., there's a lot of work to be done here. It seems to me, therefore, that there's a great need for increased momentum in creating a renewed museological practice, a renewed curatorial practice that examines not just human rights exhibits, but all exhibits, to see what narratives they support. And then fifth, let us understand that this is a relay. We need marathon runners who will endure, like Etta, like Ruben, like Bobby, like Benet, and many others that we know of. But we also need sprint runners, people who only run 100 meters, people who only run 10 meters. But today, the pandemic experience obliges all of us to understand that this is a generational relay. This work will go on beyond our lifetimes. And this is the time to think about what goes beyond our lifetimes. And so the nurturing of new generations of runners has to be undertaken consciously and conscientiously. We need to replace ourselves. We need to pass it on, but not just in telling people about the wrong things that happen, but in equipping them legally. The next Ruben Carranza, the next Eta Rosales, the next Bobby. They have to be found, they have to be trained, they have to be the next runners. We're not getting younger. And this is a intergenerational relay. This is a very serious task right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. That's a very useful and timely analogy. We've been doing a lot of running during this lockdown period, at least some of us. Yeah, we really need to expand and expand our networks and expand our alliance building efforts and continue the relay.
And the next generation.
Runner. The next generation, the handing over. Etta, you seem to want to immediately respond.
Yeah, that was beautiful, Marian, because that's true. I mean, we have to act now and we have to address the problem now. But since, you know, Bobby, you had asked me a little earlier to go into, you know, what pandemic, the pandemic plague that we have right now, how has this contributed to the kind of structures that we have? This has been discussed, but even from a historical point of view, I would just like to pass on to that and then go into Marian's 4 guidelines and recommendations to respond to that too. So in any event, I tried to look into the history of the pandemics. There were 20 worst pandemics starting from prehistory, 3,000 before the current era. Can you imagine? Up to the present. There were about 20 of that. And don't worry, I'm not going to discuss them. I'll probably just focus on one, which was the 14th century pandemic. I think they called it the bubonic plague because it took place sometime in 1346, so 7 years to 1353. But it was terrible because what it did was it contributed to the collapse of feudalism at the time and gave rise to, you know, merchants during the period of mercantilism. So I found that very interesting when I was looking into it because at that period, about a third of Europe's population was wiped out. And this included mostly the poor people, the labor force. But the shortage of the labor force actually gave an advantage to the survivors themselves. So they started demanding from the monarchs, in alliance, of course, with the barons at the time, more money. So a wage-based economy started coming up in the urban places. But the people themselves then did not redistribute the money evenly to the people, but the families started to keep their money. And interestingly enough, during that time, I'm talking about the 14th century, the Medici family took advantage. They just kept the money amongst themselves within the family. And they got richer and richer and richer, while the large population got poorer and poorer. It sounds so familiar. It's because fast forward, you look into our present days right now, there were about 10 to 20 or even more conglomerates, billionaires that have gotten richer and richer because of this pandemic. And that to me is also something that's very important that we have to address, to look at the larger picture. Because this is a class question and we have to address this too. Bakit patuloy na yumayaman? Amazon, for instance, has been gaining from this. Those in the digital economy have been gaining from this. Those who have digitized restaurants, food, and Walmart, all of them have been gaining from this current pandemic. And that is experienced now, but it was also experienced in the 14th century. That gave way to, feudalism, brought about mercantilism, eventually towards, capitalism. The early period of capitalism, industrial capitalism. So there was an article that came out from the BBC, I think, that said, if that happened in the period of the 14th century, the pandemic contributed substantially to the collapse of the old order. Do you suppose that the pandemic today will likewise contribute to the collapse of the current disorder that is bringing about confusion and a lot of suffering in our country today? This was a question, a very interesting challenge to all of us. But as pointed out by Sedge, by Mariam, who have actually answered before me, it can only be done if you have conscious, highly motivated, and informed people who will come together and link up with institutions that are willing. And as pointed out by Mariam, but it cannot be business as usual. We have to expand, and we have to expand our constituencies. I just want to add something a bit more to this. Today, as I pointed out, there have been a lot of anti-terror laws that have actually been passed very recently. It's not just the Philippines. And I'm sure Duterte learned from those other countries, Malaysia, Singapore, all around. Of course, China, Hong Kong. And in the passage of these laws, the trend towards authoritarianism is there to see. But as pointed out by some authors, authoritarianism should not even be seen as the kind of old authoritarianism that we knew before. Like a military coup would take place, there will be absolute order, absolute rule by a dictator, and they will try to rule for a long time. Right now, the kind of autocracy, the kind of authoritarianism that is being propagated is much more deceptive. And some people have called it illiberal democracy. Some people have called it electoral autocracy. And I think that for the Philippines, electoral autocracy seems to be closer to home. What do I mean by that? Mr. Duterte is he's sharp. I mean, he's cunning. He's cunning and he's clever. He cannot call for martial law nationwide. But what he does is slowly and gradually, he tries to weaken the enemies, his enemies. And slowly and gradually, he tries to weaken the institutions all around him. The anti-terror law is an issue, Marian, that is gradually bringing together a much more expansive constituency than what we had hoped for. And I'm so happy to know that, because in practice, we are trying to get the people from local governments, from the workers, the farmers, even the IPs, Sedge, even the IPs, together. And they are coming together slowly. Recently, we had our indignation rally against the anti-terror bill. And we had, innocent people like the riders, Bulacan riders, motorcycle riders, whose issues had to do with doble placa, very specific issues, but we listened to them. But they were able to link up to the larger issue of the anti-terror law. We're reaching out to the Bangsamoro people. We're reaching out to the communities. And it's hard and painstaking and persevering. But you are so correct, both of you, Sedge and Marian, when you say that we have to go to the people. We have to reach out to the grassroots. And that is exactly what we are doing. As we help them connect to, the realities that are taking place, but not to be afraid. I just want to add to this before I, let others talk, that I think something that we are very proud of, and this is with the Transitional Justice Project, despite the fears that we had, we were able to go to the grassroots communities, the slum dwellings of Metro Manila, covering Navotas, Malabon, Quezon City, Manila, these areas. We were able to focus on them and to go to people who were being killed but were not coming out in media. So we gathered them, we were able to organize them through the help of residents within the communities themselves and bring them to an institution, as pointed out by Marian kanina, the CHR. And we showed them how CHR would help document their cases, write down all their cases, which they did. And by practice, they started learning na hindi pala sila nag-iisa. Hindi pala sila hopeless. Meron palang yung may pagmamalasakit sa kanila. And slowly, we organize them. Kailangan solid organizing is there. And so we call them SHE, Samahan sa Hilom at Edukasyon. SHE. Mga kababaihan yan. May mga lalaki rin. Pero, na-organize namin sila. I want to present this to the Transition TJ Project. And matapang sila. As they went through the painstaking process of coming out and telling their stories to the CHR, lumakas sila. So one time, tinanong ko sa kanila, kaya ba ninyo na pag nakakita kayo ng mga bagong biktima ng EJK, kasi these were EJK victims, these were drug war victims, pinatay yung kanilang anak, yung asawa, yung kapatid, yung uncle, etc. Yung mga bata din, kaya ba ninyo na tumulong ngayon na organisado na kayo? Sabi nila, walang problema yan, kaya namin yan. And so they did. And so we're reaching out. Siyempre, hindi naman namin gustong ma-expand yung SHE, no? Kasi these are victim families.
Pero, yeah, thank you. Ma'am, can you wrap up? We have still so many questions.
Oh, yes. So, guys, pero yun, doon lumalabas yung organisa. I think it has to be that. You have to really reach out. So I end up with that.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Etta. I know you have a lot of stories, and the passion is actually there. And I really apologize, to have that story telling cut at this point in time. We still have one final question, specific question for this round, and that is for Ruben. And essentially, Ruben, you walked us through a while ago insofar as the experiences of the Arab Spring, of Tunisia, of Chad, of South Sudan in terms of transitional justice, of how you were working on it, on these cases or country experiences prior to the pandemic. But now, in the current situation, there are a lot of other things that essentially have been layered on them, and so on and so forth. So my question, Ruben, is it enough, the transitional justice lens? Because by definition, it is actually something that deals with the past. It actually, I'm trying to invoke the transitional justice framework on matters of continuing as well as ongoing injustices. I mean, and particularly in the context of a pandemic, this is unprecedented, at this point in time. So how do you think, we can prevent atrocities during this ongoing pandemic and exacting accountability as they are currently committed? Can you please elaborate on that, Ruben?
Salamat. And it's also an opportunity to, I think, address some of the questions that I see in the chat box. One question, for instance, is whether transitional justice should be seen as a post-mortem, something that only happens after a transition takes place, after a government ends, after a dictator falls, or after a conflict is over. And the quickest answer is no, and not necessarily. But before I go into elaborate into the, on that answer, perhaps something interesting as a follow-up to what Etta said. Let me just read this quote from an academic work. So it begins by saying that the pandemic exhibited the same virological and epidemiological characteristics in the Philippines as it did in the rest of the world. However, the portrayal of the disease, ineffective quarantine measures, bureaucratic problems, military mobilization, and other factors made the experience of the pandemic historically peculiar, and the admission by authorities of failure in combating the disease has yet to enter historical assessment in the Philippines. That is from a paper written in 2009 by a Filipino public health scholar assessing the Philippines' response to the 1918 pandemic. So you can see from that there has been some effort to examine how the Philippines responds to a large-scale, massive public health crisis, and one of them is the only other pandemic that some of us in the human race have experienced in their lifetime 100 years ago. And it's not the only, and so it echoes some of the questions that I think have arisen in the response of the Philippine government to the ongoing pandemic, including, for example, the use of military officials as a public health response. For a second now, I will wear my former Assistant Secretary of Defense hat to quickly and sweepingly say that the military, its competence is obviously in military matters, and some of them are not even competent in that. If you assign public health duties to them, they will respond with a military response. You cannot use a gun to kill a virus. And that's what Rodrigo Duterte has been trying to do in this pandemic. So it's very important to not just to look at transitional justice and whether it can respond to abuses in an ongoing pandemic, but to also ask what transitional justice can stop. That the kinds of responses to a pandemic that transitional justice can stop, and one of them is a military response to a pandemic. Now, an example of a post-pandemic truth-seeking process also happened after the 1918 pandemic. In New Zealand, the government set up a pandemic inquiry commission to examine how the pandemic spread in New Zealand, why the response was delayed, how many persons were killed, and what should be done by the government to prevent it from happening again. And this was for the 1918 pandemic. I'm not I'm not an expert enough to be able to say that that response in 1918 accounts for how New Zealand has been able to respond to the pandemic in 2020. But it tells us a possible lesson that you can, in fact, learn lessons about public health through truth-seeking. So is it possible to address public health issues with transitional justice? The answer is yes. But that's not really Bobby's question. Is it possible to use transitional justice to address ongoing conflict and ongoing abuses? The answer is yes, but not completely. Because normally we address human rights abuses and human rights violations in court. We go to court, we sue someone, we hope a judge rules in our favor. When violations are massive, when they're systematic, and when they're prolonged, it's not possible to go to court for all of them. Sometimes because there are no actual courts that function. In Syria, for instance, because courts and prosecutors are not trusted, which is possibly something that is happening in the Philippines, or because a judicial response is simply inadequate. So it's important to look at transitional justice as not simply a judicial response. You have truth commissions, you have reparations programs, you have memorialization that Marian was able to talk about. So there are other non-judicial responses that transitional justice is good at. Now, there are also abuses that can no longer be brought to court, that in fact you cannot go to court anymore. And one of them comes from the Philippines as an example, Averka versus Ver, the longest running torture case in the Philippines that involves, as one of the respondents who committed torture during the Marcos dictatorship, a certain Lieutenant Panfilo Lacson. So Lieutenant Lacson was sued for committing torture against several respondents. Some of them are now dead. The case went back and forth across the Philippines judiciary. And it's obvious that the judiciary in the Philippines was never able to provide redress and justice for the victims of torture, for those who were tortured by Panfilo Lacson. And where is Panfilo Lacson now? What is Panfilo Lacson doing for accountability? So you can see here that if you rely only on courts for transitional justice, it will be inadequate. It will likely not be enough. There are also going to be cases when going to court won't bring back the life, for instance, of a tricycle driver killed in the drug war. What will going to court do for the family of the tricycle driver? What will going to court do for a 16-year-old boy who can no longer go back to school because he was murdered by policemen? So the response here could be reparations. And reparations can be pursued for victims of the drug war in the Philippines even now. Now, at the International Criminal Court, for example, victims can apply for reparations, but only once charges are confirmed. In other words, when the case is already pending. Should we wait for that? The answer is obviously no. So there are, in fact, steps that can be taken now to prepare for transitional justice, or even to provide transitional justice measures for victims. And as a final point, can truth-seeking be done while a pandemic is going on? In other words, you have two burdens here. A pandemic is happening and abuses are going on. In the commission of inquiry that is likely going to be established by the UN Human Rights Council is an example of truth-seeking and perhaps individual accountability that can happen during a pandemic and can happen while abuses are still going on. Why? Because there is enough documentation already, and I've done some work with some institutions in the Philippines and outside of the Philippines on this. There's enough documentation to examine who should be held accountable for the killings in the drug war, and to establish the truth about the drug war. For instance, whether only 8,000 people were killed by the Philippine National Police. What about the ICC case? It's been over a year since the preliminary examination was opened. And so it's been a while, and so relying on that alone will not be sufficient. A new prosecutor will be elected by the states that are parties to the ICC, which excludes the Philippines now, in December. That new prosecutor, who will replace Fatou Bensouda, will serve for 9 years. So it's very likely that any trial involving the Philippines will happen only after 2020. It could also be something that will only happen way past this pandemic, and therefore relying on that will be insufficient. Also, an ICC trial will be limited to a handful of individuals, and only those who are alive by the time the trial begins can be actually tried. So you can imagine who might be dead and can no longer be tried by the ICC. So the other option that can be pursued even now in the Philippines are domestic prosecutions, which is of course something that some of you might do an eye roll about. But look, let me give you an example. In March last year, or I think it was 2 years ago or last year, let me check, yes, last year, a member of the Maute ISIS group that fought in Marawi was actually convicted of both rebellion and a crime against humanity under Philippine law on crimes against humanity. So if this is possible against ISIS, why is it not possible against policemen who kill unarmed civilians? And if this is possible even prior to the anti-terrorism law, why would you need an anti-terrorism law now? So there are things that can be done even now, even in the burden of a pandemic. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Ruben. Thank you very much to all our thought provocateurs. Definitely, you know, there are so much things to actually process, and we have been receiving comments both in the Zoom as well as the Facebook Live. You know that ang bilis ng discussion, and people are actually trying to really follow. I'd read a few questions. They did not the ones who actually asked them did not specifically say who they would want to ask it, but we have about 30 to 40 minutes to have our open forum. So reading from the questions that were sent to us, especially the ones that have not been addressed insofar as the second round of the question and answer portion is concerned. So very, very specific. What is the role of the judiciary within the TJR national framework, and especially on how it is being implemented in the BARM? Okay, again, so what is the role of the judiciary within the TJR national framework, especially on how it is being implemented in the BARM? Second question, aside from a very long stride of the transitional justice mechanism to set in national policy level, what are practical steps or mechanisms an ordinary citizen can do or work in pushing forward transitional justice in the grassroots community, utilizing social media platform and fronting young people during this pandemic? And then the last question was sent, I think this was in the Facebook Live, at least for this round. Ironically, many of those who voted for Duterte and other strongmen around the world did so perhaps because of their way of administering transitional justice, as they have been victims, quote unquote, of a skewed and flawed system presided over by a liberal elite that have continually failed them in the past. Thus, they might have been seen that these are outside of the box leaders as saviors, quote unquote, of sorts, and they themselves are rendering, quote unquote, justice to their generational woes. So how do we address this phenomenon? So these are the three questions first, and we'll have another round, hopefully. So any of the panelists can answer any of those questions, please.
Maybe I should answer the last question. Okay, I should answer the last question because I think it's good to contextualize that. I don't think transitional justice promises that elections will always lead to the election of democratic, human rights sensitive, and populist leaders. That would be too much of a burden. I think what transitional justice promises to do is to set up mechanisms for holding anyone who is elected accountable. And that's the huge difference between, say, having transitional justice and not having transitional justice at all. Which is not to say that those mechanisms will work. Brazil, for instance, had a commission that examined enforced disappearances during the dictatorship. Brazil then later had a truth commission that examined a larger set of human rights violations during the entire period of military junta rule. And yet Brazil elected Jair Bolsonaro. So you can imagine that mechanisms can only work if you make them work, but it's also very possible that because transitional justice limits itself to addressing physical integrity violations, and not the kinds of inequality that breed discontent, that then leads to populist authoritarian elected leaders, then it's transitional justice that also has a problem with the way it's designed. So let me stop there for the moment.
I think Sedge also wants to answer some of the questions.
Okay, thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Bobby. Sagutin ko lang yung, I think, one question with regard to what ordinary citizens can do. The second question that Vinay posed, aside from the very long stride of transitional justice, at the national policy level, what are the practical steps? I think the first thing really is, of course, to equip ourselves with the knowledge and the analysis. I think that's always the very first things. But actually, it's really to reach out. And I know that the pandemic has given us some challenges, but with the digitization, indeed, of social media, I find myself personally, for example, here in Davao, Mindanao, talking to a lot more internally displaced persons associations than I ever did before, which has actually been very interesting for me. And that I don't even need to travel. And many of the organizations that deal with who are internally displaced and who deal with the pandemic has been more in touch with me now than ever before. So really it's the use of digital technology, definitely. And in the work that I do, I provide a lot of advice. But also yesterday, I was on the line with Libya, for example, with the authority that deals with internally displaced persons in Libya. I visited Libya. I was in Libya in 2018, I think, and I stayed there for about 10 days, going to a lot of IDP camps and communities and visiting IDPs who were actually hiding and interviewing them, particularly in Tripoli, and also some who exiled themselves in Tunis. But what this guy was now telling me and asking for my advice with regard to how to deal with IDPs in Libya during the pandemic was the fact that they are adjusting the mechanisms that they have set up before on reconciliation and reparations. And there are, we don't have to talk about the Libyan situation here, but the lesson there is that some of us do have some mechanisms that we can already use. In indigenous peoples, for example, in certain countries in Latin America, they have started to use their statutory and customary statutory mechanisms to continue their work for justice, because they are also in the process, have been in the process of trying to get those, the justice that they have had as IDPs already. And again, adjusting and taking into consideration what they can do, because actually there is a lot of knowledge and a lot of local mechanisms. And I think it's these local mechanisms are really important. And unfortunately, as people who work at the national or international level, I'm sometimes guilty of this. We always look at the classic mechanisms, but actually it's really creativity. If the classic thinking out of the box. I hate that term, but frankly I cannot think of something else. But using what there is at the local level. And this is, I think, where the participation of the people themselves can come in order that they can continue the struggle, the search for justice that they have. And in the application of transitional justice within the pandemic, they use also, whatever the TJ lens provides them. I have a lot of different examples from all over the world, precisely because, in the past 1.5 months, I've been on the phone or on WhatsApp, on social media, and it's incredible, the wealth there. So let's not be makitid sa pag-iisip let's try things in order to push the search for justice. Yun lang po.
Can I say something to add? And I promise I'll be brief. No, I just want to add to what Sedge was saying. The number 2 question about the grassroots and what we can do against the context of the pandemic that's going on and the possibilities of institutions being utilized. As I said a while ago, we are doing this right now, and the constituencies should make use of social media effectively by, group chats. Actually, I've attended so many webinars. I've been learning so much about what's going on. And now I think that if we solidly organize, we have to reach out to organize to the communities, get these communities through group chats, organize the network, use social media, and get the academic institutions to relate to them. We have a lot of experts in the institutions. I'm a teacher myself in the College of St. Benilde, and there's nothing to stop us from getting these institutions to provide materials that are easy to be able to relate to the grassroots. This is being done right now, especially education is online. Education is online and deliberately will be online as far as Mr. Duterte is concerned. It stops, he is able to stop students from being able to mobilize themselves in schools. But truly, while we really have to safeguard ourselves because the pandemic, by the way, just to say to you, there is a news report that there's a bubonic plague outburst somewhere in Northeast China today, as of news today, as Bolsonaro has been tested positive in Brazil. I just want to bring that out. So it's going on. The pandemic will still go on, and I don't think you can stop it. But with the grassroots, we can use social media, digital media, and it becomes easier to get the institutions, social institutions, academic institutions, to be able to relate to them. I'll stop right there. Even, by the way, the other thing that I want to add is that local government has become much, much more central, front and central to the ways of solving this pandemic. And it is a way of decentralizing the functions of governance to local government. They're coming out. A number of them are showing the way. And I think that we can learn from them. We can link up with government down to the barangay level. These are just some of the points that I want to raise because we're doing it right now. When, Marian mentioned the institutions, museums, we have a museum on human rights. It's a bit slow, really a bit slow, but never mind. We have to just give all out support there. But there's a lot of documentation going on now.
Yeah, and that's already a work in progress. There's already a design for that martial law museum, and it's in the works. Actually, as far as I know, Marian is also involved in designing that.
Yes.
Well, let us, if we can continue with there are so many questions here. It's a bit hard to choose, but we can try that. One got particularly curious about the quotation given by Ruben earlier about this assessment of the pandemic response in the Philippines in 1918. Did I get that correctly?
Yeah, and I posted the article, so you can read it. It's a very good piece about that.
My history is correct. The Philippines is still under U.S. colonial rule at that time, so. So if there's a highly military response to that pandemic, then we know who is partly or fully to blame. But that's probably another story. Anyway, there is this long and I believe is relevant question given at the Zoom. There has been an increase in the human rights and IHL violations during the pandemic based on the monitoring of our organization. The questioner didn't mention his or her organization, but I suppose it's related to peace and human rights monitoring. In fact, even in the midst of the humanitarian ceasefire declaration by both the government and the CPP, NPA, and DF, there has been increase in military operations to continue and intensify Oplan Sauron. I'm not sure where Oplan Sauron is, but I guess that's in Mindanao. We are challenged by the peace facilitator since we would like to implement TJR, or I suppose Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Project in the areas targeted by Oplan Sauron as a measure to address the situation which involves communities. My question their question is, will TJR be a process acceptable to both parties? Therefore, accepting our project, will TJR as a framework and process be helpful to address the issues of the communities in terms of rampant human rights violations? So this question has to do with the armed insurgency and how acceptable is TJ as a mechanism and framework, not only in addressing the armed conflict situation, but in making probably both parties accountable for violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the course of war. Probably let's stay with that question for now because it's a bit long and complicated. Does anyone want to respond?
Let me try a quick and perhaps simplistic response. Local transitional justice initiatives have happened in other countries. Many of them happened post-conflict. Many of them happened in relation more to historical injustices than to conflict. But many of them have happened as well in the context of ongoing conflict, but largely because a peace process is going on. So let me focus on Colombia as an example. ICTJ, where I work, has an office in Colombia. And in fact, our head of office was nominated by the parties to the peace process in Colombia, the FARC and the Colombian government, to be part of this selection committee to select the truth commissioners who form now part of the larger Truth Commission. But even prior to this, local meetings, because the armed group FARC, while it's called FARC, really consists of different local armed groups, have to be convinced to allow and acknowledge the fact that there will be people who will also have grievances against them, seeking justice for those grievances. And so this combination of persons who were aggrieved by war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by FARC or committed by the government ended up being on the same side of the table when the peace process was going on in Havana, Cuba. So you have a victims table, and the victims table included both victims of FARC and victims of the government. So that's one dynamic that this question has to take into account, because it's one thing to look at the community as if it were neutral. Many communities will not be neutral. They will be victims of grievances one way or the other. And a peace process that is only local will not really address those grievances, because as in the peace process involving the National Democratic Front, that is a national peace process. So just to round up this question, it is possible you could convene localized discussions, even perhaps in an ongoing conflict, but a lot of that will depend on the credibility of the parties themselves. The NDF, for example, and this is a personal opinion, the NDF has to its credit pursued, for example, reparations for victims of the Marcos dictatorship in the course of the decades of peace negotiations, and that to its credit. But it's also the NDF who, in many ways, allowed Duterte to come to power, or to at least commit the abuses he has committed while in power. And so there are questions about accountability that should also be raised involving the NDF. And so if you have a local discussion about accountability and justice, it's very possible that those grievances will come up, even as they can also come up involving the military. So there are a lot of hurdles to that, but it's possible and it can happen.
Thanks a lot for that response, Ruben. Actually, the one who gave that question clarified that Oplan Sauron is Eastern Visayas, Samar, and Bicol. And as far as localized peace processes go, in fact, the government and the military is pushing that now, localized peace processes, because as we know, the peace talks at the national level is presently a failure, and it's not moving an inch. And unlike the peace process at the BARM, which has really significantly progressed, the one with the CPP-NPA has not had a foothold. So maybe before we continue reading another question, Marian would like to give a follow-up to Ruben.
Just to Ruben, I actually want to connect the last question that Ruben answered and the previous one about social media and expanding constituency. I think that the difference between our circumstances today, even with a pandemic, is the connectability factor. It is actually possible for the public in general to do their own documentation of what happened in different parts of the Philippines. If a constituency can be built on a national level, then in a sense, things cannot happen in the dark. The things that photographs can circulate, and it has been the case in many, well, in not too many instances, but it has happened. The only reason that the perpetrators of the Kian murder was actually tried and put to jail was because there was a video, and the video circulated on social media. So if the constituency is on cyberspace, if the constituency can actually document what in fact happened during particular operations, particular events, what really happened, the killing of the military by the police in Jolo would not have been known to us if it didn't circulate on social media. So we do have a moment in history right now where things do not necessarily have to happen in the dark.
Yeah, thanks for that addition, Marian. Actually, there's a comment very much related to that, and I would like to read that as well. This says, aside from the very long, this question was already asked earlier, but it emphasizes the role of grassroots communities in utilizing social media platform and fronting young people. And we cannot overemphasize the importance of social media right now in pushing for accountability and monitoring. Even though admittedly it is still basically not a neutral tool, it's controlled by powerful interests, and for the most part it's being used by bad actors, as Marian would put it. But then we cannot concede that battle.
All right, Bobby. Probably I'll just read two more questions that's also coming from the FB as well as Facebook. May I also invite the panelists to also check the Q&A box, just in case we're not able to read everything. If you could be so kind to actually answer the questions by typing in your response. So the question here is it possible to achieve transitional justice within the current political setup? Or can we only gain it fully or substantially when the prevailing system is fundamentally overhauled? So this is from a participant coming from Davao. And the other, let me read in the Q&A box. Again, going back to the judiciary, the rule of law and accountability would need an independent judiciary. The gradual weakening in the judiciary in the past led the current regime to weaponize the law. Can we restore, or how can we restore and strengthen the court to ensure its independence? And we'll have the responses from the panelists, please.
Okay, silence. It's really a long haul process, but I'd like to actually inquire from somebody as veteran as Etta, if she thinks that something as destroyed as the judiciary can be attended to with immediate, practical activities to restore it over the long haul.
Yes, yes, I think so. Because as I said, if the pandemic has helped us decentralize and look into our local communities, that includes local government, local schools, local judicial courts, and
Yes.
no? And once we are able to, as a community, come together locally, but link up nationally through our networks, we can encourage relationships to be developed with our local judge, with a local municipal court, with a local, the administrative machinery within the court system. They're not one monolithic, puppets to the executive. No, it's really very diverse. A lot of these judges want to come out as independent. And we've seen examples of this. So it's possible, but it necessitates solid organizing and local alliance work within the communities that should be guided.
Okay.
Let me add something, and that's a really great point, Etta, that there will be, and there are judges who will be either courageous enough or be decent enough to pursue accountability. What I think is important to remember is that the length of time it takes to pursue cases will be a problem, even when there are judges who are willing to pursue cases involving human rights abuse, even under the current situation in the Philippines. But let me mention a few examples where independent judges have acted and started the ball rolling. In Guatemala, the only reason, for example, that crimes against humanity cases were resumed against former dictator Rios Montt, who has since passed away, was because one judge decided that she will approve the filing of a crimes against humanity case against the former dictator. The only reason that cases against death squads in El Salvador were resumed in 2017 was because one local judge decided he would order the exhumation of bodies in a mass grave and then decide to investigate and prosecute those who were responsible. So it's very possible that this can happen. The problem is, of course, institutional trust, whether people trust the judiciary enough that they will in fact go to court, that they will in fact testify in court, that they will in fact not be afraid to prosecute or to pursue their cases. And that's one fundamental problem in the Philippines, where you have a Supreme Court that has been co-opted by an authoritarian ruler. And of course, it's not the first time that has happened in the Philippines. So there are answers to that in many post-authoritarian countries. In one country I work in, Armenia, which has just had a revolution in 2018, and is now in the process of vetting judges and to undertake judicial reforms at the very top, beginning at the very top. And it's difficult, but it's possible. But it's only possible if it's done systematically. It cannot be done in a haphazard way against individual judges.
Can I just add something very briefly?
Yata we might be running out of time.
Really?
Very quickly lang, Bobby.
Very quickly lang.
Sige, can we just give 1 minute for each, Eta and
Oh,
Sedge?
sige. Briefly lang. Hindi, kasi yung example ni Ruben, ganun din yung experience ko. My experience was when I was CHR chair, I was on the last leg of my term. Kokoy Tulawi, the human rights advocate, CHR was able to work with the administrative court of the Supreme Court. At that time, it was a time when, what's his name, the Chief Justice was being impeached by the administration in last year. So I was still chair, but I was able to get the Supreme Court's help to help me access the regional trial court of Davao, where Kokoy Tulawi was, and the Sulu governor was going to get him to bring him to Sulu and, you know, probably execute him. But through that network, we were able to get the help of the regional trial court, and we got him to ride the airplane and go to Zamboanga. And by Zamboanga, we got in touch also with the regional trial court of Zamboanga, and the Zamboanga judge got Kokoy Tulawi and helped bring him under the administration. So when the police from Sulu came to try and arrest Kokoy Tulawi, the judge said, no, this is under my jurisdiction. That happened, and that is an example of how regional trial courts, local courts can help with CHR. I was chair then, and we saved Kokoy Tulawi's life. That's an example. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Eta. 1 minute from Sedge. Just to remind everyone that we will actually be cut at 11 a.m. So we still need to give some time for the chair of CHR to give his closing remarks. So please go ahead with your 1 minute, Sedge. Thanks.
Sige, baka less than 1 minute. Maybe it's a very obvious thing to say, but with reference to the people in the judiciary and who composes it, I think it's dito pumapasok yung pagkahalaga ng mga law schools themselves. And as well, I go back to what I had said very early. The right to truth in transitional justice is not only the facts of particular cases or situations. It's also the narratives, maybe contested, maybe different, pero kailangan kasi ang mga law students, well, you know, I had that experience, has to be exposed not only to the law books, but to the society and the need for justice in society. And that is, for me, one of the basics that we need to continuously advocate for a relevant, justice-oriented law education. Yun lang po.
Thanks, Sedge. Yeah, true. Law schools need to be relevant. So with that note, we would like to call the chair of the Commission on Human Rights, Jose Luis Martin Gascon, we fondly call Chito, give us our summative remarks. Please go ahead.
I just want to thank our panelists. I will refer to them in the order of their presentations at the beginning of our forum. Special Rapporteur Sedge Jimenez, our dear curator Marian, Pastor Roses, our former chair of the Commission on Human Rights, on whose shoulders we here in the Commission on Human Rights continue to stand upon, Eta Gonzalez, and of course, my dear friend, professor, although he's my age, but he was my teacher, Ruben Carranza, for a very rich discussion about the issues of transitional justice, not just in the context of the pandemic, but also in the context of the problems with respect to conflict and human rights violations the Philippines has been experiencing even prior to the pandemic. What is very clear is that what has happened in the course of this pandemic is that there is a new layer of issues and concerns and violations that could in fact be of a widespread character because the response of the state in the context of the pandemic, rather than approach it from a public health perspective primarily, has, as was discussed by many of you, been a more strong arm. And so there are clearly violations. In fact, the Commission on Human Rights has recorded significant complaints in the course of the pandemic. And so the transitional justice lens is very critical for us as we move forward on all of the issues that were brought to the table in the course of this 2-hour forum. So we're grateful to the four of you as our resource persons. We look forward to continuing to partner with you as we address all of these issues. This Commission on Human Rights puts priority on transitional justice, and we're grateful to Professor Benet for guiding us, and of course to Bobby, who is the focal person on our transitional justice work, because we will need to continue the work, even though we have to work online more often now. We still hope for the day when we could meet face to face and build that constituency that we need to strengthen throughout the country for human rights and transitional justice, to inspire courage. I learned that also from many of you in the course of our conversations, because we need to demand accountability, truth, and reparation for all the violations, whether this occurred in previous times as well as today. We're also grateful to all those who had participated, who registered and watched, who sent in questions. We will take note of all of these questions. We will endeavor to respond to them. We have actually with me here, you just don't see them on camera, our crisis conflict humanitarian protection team. And we are really, really grateful to all of you, those who spoke, and those who moderated, and those who have participated by listening. This could not have happened without the support of the Asian Center for that responsibility to protect, the Ateneo de Manila Political Science Department, and Areté Sandbox Program. And let's continue our conversation, but more importantly, the actions that must be taken moving forward to ensure accountability and transparency and human rights in this country, and as Ruben highlights for us, in the world. So maraming salamat, mabuhay po kayo.
Thank you very much, Chito, and thank you so much as well for the support. And of course, I would like to thank our thought provocateurs. You know, you really provoked our thoughts and our ideas, and has actually inflamed the passion that has been there, but then again with a lot of doubt and worry. So at this point, I would also like to say thank you to our participants. I know that there have been a lot of questions that have not been answered, but well, do take note that we would be sending, or we have taken note of those questions, and we would be sending back the responses as soon as we can via email. And speaking of email, we would have a post-webinar survey, and this will be sent to you via email. So once again, thank you very much to everyone. We look forward to having you again in similar conversations. Thank you and good morning.
And thanks, of course, to Benet for being the prime mover of this webinar. And let's hope there will be more of the same. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.